As the deadline approached for a 2-week truce between the United States, Israel and Iran, many around the world, anxious to discover whether the next step was likely to be a peace deal or renewed fighting, were probably holding their breath. As it turns out, it now looks like they're going to be holding it at least a bit longer, with the US announcing an extension of the ceasefire, if you can call it that, along with the continuation of a recently announced blockade against Iranian ports. Now, on one hand, that means the video on the outcomes of the ceasefire I was going to do probably now needs to wait a little bit longer, but I do think it provides a bit of an opportunity to pause and take stock of some of the military lessons this war has arguably already surfaced. Because after weeks of combat, billions of dollars worth of equipment lost and tens of thousands of munitions expended, I think there's an imperative to start discussing some of the early observations now, on the understanding that even if detailed lessons learned will take much longer, that when it comes to the lessons of combat, there are often only going to be two options. Either a force takes an opportunity to learn where it can, or it takes the risk that potential competitors go ahead and learn those lessons first. To do that, we're going to work through a couple of points in sequence. First, there'll be a very quick update explaining the current ceasefire environment and what that means for the current cadence of the fighting. Noting we'll go into that topic a lot more detail in the future once the outcome of that ceasefire becomes more certain. Then we'll get into some tentative early military observations, touching on a bunch of different domains as we do, including air, land, sea and space. For each of those, I'm going to try and ask 4 questions. What have we seen? What might that demonstrate? And what has that potentially meant for the actors involved? What's the impact, for example, for the United States and its allies, knowing that Iran has proven able to score hits on valuable targets like ground-based radars, and the critical enablers, think tankers and AWACS, that are often going to be fundamental to the ability of the United States to fight a US-style air war. Finally, we'll look at how some other nations observing these events might choose to respond, and what it might potentially mean for the military balance if some powers choose to learn and act on a lesson that others decide to ignore. Before we get into it though, let me welcome back a returning sponsor. So let me welcome back a long-term sponsor of the channel, Private Internet Access. In a world where even a frontline trench can have high-speed internet, and we're talking about putting communication satellites around the moon, I think it's fair to say that digital connectivity has gone global or beyond. At the same time though, where you connect from can matter. And so if you're looking to manage in a very useful but highly fragmented digital environment, then you might want to be layering different tools and practices together. Just as a piece of military equipment might incorporate different survivability features, there are a bunch of things you might want to do when thinking about digital privacy. A lot of those I've talked about in the past. Protect your device with good passwords and be careful about what sort of data you're putting out there in the first place. And if you're like me, you might also want to use a VPN. With a click, what that can allow you to do is reroute internet traffic and also change your publicly perceived IP address, with Private Internet Access offering servers in 90 countries around the world and all 50 US states. They also advertise availability cross-platform, an open source codebase, compatibility with a range of streaming services, and thankfully for someone like me who's always going to have more than one piece of hardware on the go, here a single subscription allows you to cover an unlimited number of devices. And so if you'd like that in your toolkit, there'll be a link in the description which will give you access to an 83% discount on a 2-year subscription plus 4 bonus months, covering an unlimited number of devices with a 30-day money-back guarantee. And so, with my thanks to PIA as always, let's get back to it. Okay, so firstly, let's just capture where we are in terms of the current war, and why this might be an invaluable opportunity for both sides to quickly capture and act on some of those early lessons. Following talks in Pakistan, it was announced that there would be a 2-week truce between the United States, Iran and Israel beginning on April 8th. That was originally due to last 2 weeks to allow for additional talks, and from the beginning was kind of strange as far as ceasefires go. For one, it seems to have ended parts of the fighting, sure, like the US and Israeli strike campaigns into Iran proper, or the Iranians launching missiles and drones against the Israelis or their regional neighbours. In the maritime domain, things were a lot less clear, meaning that as at time of recording, even though a ceasefire is nominally in place, the Strait of Hormuz and surrounding waters still look awfully like a war zone, with the Iranians continuing to inhibit traffic, while the United States, as we'll get into a bit later on, has also gotten into the game by responding to the de facto Iranian blockade with a blockade of its own. The current situation then can best be described as one somewhere between all-out conventional war and an actual ceasefire. You have ongoing economic pressure being applied by both sides at sea, while the diplomats presumably talk, and militaries on all sides gear up for a potential resumption of hostilities. What that means is that for the militaries involved, there's been a period of a couple of weeks now to potentially take stock and catch their breath. And I'd argue that for us as observers, it provides an opportunity to do the same. So what are the kind of potential high-level observations we're interested in here? I think 2 things to say up front is that observations don't have to be entirely new in order to be valuable. Sometimes just having more data to prove or disprove old ideas can be valuable in and of itself. It's also worth noting that we shouldn't assume that the way things turned out during the fighting are the only way they could have turned out. As it stands, for example, the Iranians have caused significantly fewer American military casualties during the war than some war games previously suggested, and with a different roll of the dice or two, perhaps things could have been different. What we're perhaps most interested in are observations that aren't unique or distinct to the circumstances of this particular war, but which could potentially be applied to other scenarios and contexts. Even if the Iranian missile force, for example, wasn't able to accomplish a given goal, what it was able to achieve still might give us some clues as to what another country, with a larger or more capable missile force, might be able to do in different circumstances. Basically, we're after specific observations that might be more generally applicable. And so to demonstrate what I mean there, let's jump straight into the first one. A lesson that's not so much being learned as confirmed about the incredible fragility and vulnerability of global maritime trade, especially given this is now a war where we have not just one, but two states putting determined effort into squeezing the kind of trade they think benefits the other side. I think the initial observations here are relatively simple. One, the Iranian Navy, both regular and IRGC, have been absolutely poleaxed by American air power. We'll go through the detailed losses in the future, but for now suffice to say that the Iranians began this war with a pretty significant collection of larger surface combatants and entered the ceasefire period with many new artificial reefs. However, despite that, we're still led to observation 2. Just like the Ukrainians and Houthis before them, who proved you can make anti-access area denial work without having much of a regular navy, the Iranians have continued to be very successful, putting the squeeze on maritime trade in the Persian Gulf, through the Strait of Hormuz, and beyond. That squeeze continued even as US claims of the number of Iranian vessels destroyed crossed the 200 mark, bombs rained down on Iranian coastal missile installations, and the US government began to intervene in the maritime insurance market. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that the Iranian effort was so successful that it continued to effectively operate even once a ceasefire was nominally in place. Because you could argue what we've got is not so much a suspension of the fighting, but more a limitation of it. The airstrikes in Iran have stopped short, as well as Iranian missile attacks against the Gulf states. But what about potentially the most important piece of strategic geography in all of this? The Strait of Hormuz. When the ceasefire was being discussed, previewed, and eventually announced, it certainly seemed like the main reason to agree to one, at least from an American perspective, was to open said strait. Washington's statements on the ceasefire leading up to it suggested that all American military objectives had been met, and the Iranians agreed to, quote, the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz, end quote. You could argue from an American perspective that might make a degree of strategic sense. They were giving up their major source of leverage against the Iranian government, the constant rain of bombs and missiles, and in exchange, Iran would suspend its use of the main strategic lever it had against the United States and its Gulf allies, pressure on the Strait and global energy markets. The thing is, I'd argue, in practice, the air and missile campaign may have stopped, but in the Strait, it wasn't that simple. Even if you've been following fairly closely over the last fortnight or so, tracking every time the Strait has been declared open, closed, or open with a caveat would have been a bit of an ask, given just how frequently it seemed to bloody change. Late on the 17th of April, for example, the Iranian foreign minister posted on social media that, quote, the passage for all commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz is declared completely open for the remaining period of the ceasefire, on the coordination route as already announced by the Ports and Maritime Organization of the Islamic Republic of Iran, end quote. However, apparently either something changed dramatically or the Iranians were operating under a very different definition of open than anyone else, and less than 48 hours later, it was being reported the Iranians had fired on 2 Indian-flagged vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, forcing them and a lot of other traffic to turn back, while a lot of other stranded ships hadn't started their journey out in the first place. Tracked incidents have continued in recent days. Global shipping companies are generally pretty risk-averse and not keen on playing games of red light, green light, and so are probably unlikely to get ships moving at peacetime-style levels, unless they're very, very sure that peacetime-style conditions are actually going to continue for more than a couple of hours or days at a time, with the IRGC saying that it had boarded and captured a pair of container ships that attempted to sail through the strait, with the 2 ships described as the MSC Francesca and the Epimenides. Helpfully for verification purposes, the Iranians did release video of those alleged incidents, and they were reported by the UK MTO. So basically, to paraphrase a US comment from earlier in the war, the Strait of Hormuz is totally open to shipping if only the Iranians would stop shooting at things. They are, though, of course, hence the less than open strait, and compared to before the ceasefire, now it's actually even more complicated than that, because apparently, after not being able to break the Iranian blockade militarily, the United States settled on the next best thing, blockading it as well. Which gets us to another potential observation about the naval war. Inhibiting trade using an unconventional force of missiles, drones and speedboats, for example, does seem to work, but inhibiting trade using a regular blue water navy, you guessed it, also seems to work. And the kind of unconventional force the Iranians have that might be well suited to choking off trade has seemed to struggle a lot more at preventing the US Navy from standing off at a distance and basically doing the same. Now, okay, I get it. If you don't think about it too much, blockading a blockade sounds like a bit of an unconventional manoeuvre. But if you think about it a bit more deeply, we actually kind of saw this coming. A while ago, before this announcement, I briefly dialed into a discussion that was being hosted by Chris Cappy over at Cappy Army. At that point, there was a lot of talk in the media about the prospect of an American amphibious operation to seize Karg Island. Remember, that serves as the Iranians' primary oil export terminal, and so if the US was able to seize it, they'd put a pretty hard stop to a lot of Iran's hydrocarbon exports. No exports, no foreign currency, and a pretty useful card to play in any negotiations. The bit that never made much sense to me, though, as I said in that discussion, is why the US would ever take such a risky option. Why would you deploy ground forces to seize a defended objective just off the Iranian coast that would be in drone and artillery range, for example, just to stop tankers loading up with Iranian oil? You're the United States. You have the world's most powerful navy, a defined geographic choke point. Why not just interdict the tankers themselves? Because it doesn't really matter if they can load up successfully if they can't then make it past a maritime blockade and get to the global market. Cut forward a bit, and that appears to be the option Washington's gone with. That said, the initial US announcement of the blockade was, shall we say, unconventional, in the sense that it was the kind of news that might cause your signal inbox to melt down because of the sheer tsunami of messages and question marks that followed. With a blockade, the announcement matters because, according to international law, what a belligerent has to do is announce the existence of a blockade, its geographic limitations, and essentially its starting date and its scope, noting that normally you'd be expected to give at least some time for neutral ships to clear the affected area. Instead, the announcement we saw from President Trump went as follows, quote, "Effective immediately, the United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz." End quote. Effective immediately obviously doesn't leave a lot of time for potentially involved ships, and much more importantly, saying any and all ships, on a plain reading, would suggest the United States was intending to shut down all traffic in or out of the strait, whether it was going to Iran or not. One imagines that probably caused some temporary confusion in ships that were meant to travel to the likes of Kuwait or the UAE as opposed to Iran, but the messaging was quickly clarified by US Central Command. Turns out the United States wasn't actually intending to blockade its Gulf allies, nor was the blockade effective immediately. Instead, it was due to be enforced, quote, "against vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, including all Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf or the Gulf of Oman," end quote. CENTCOM also helpfully clarified that they would not, quote, "impede freedom of navigation for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz to and from non-Iranian ports," end quote. The US then subsequently issued a formal blockade notice, and the blockade line was drawn. What the US Navy appears to be doing with this blockade is not trying to push into and fish for targets in the Strait of Hormuz itself. Instead, the de facto blockade line is further away from potential Iranian threats, making it harder for the Iranians to target the US ships involved, with the US essentially being able to then net ships that have picked up Iranian oil and are trying to sell it abroad. No need to grab Karg Island, because you can just grab the tankers. For some commentators, this change in US strategy did raise a couple of questions. For one, why the major shift in American approach? Remember, during the early phase of the war, American policy seemed consistent with trying to keep Iranian oil flowing. They didn't interdict or block tankers, they didn't bomb the energy infrastructure on Karg Island, and they specifically lifted some sanctions to enable Iranian oil that was already at sea to be sold into the global market. Basically, initially at least, Washington seemed happy for Iran to sell basically as much oil as possible, which makes turning around and imposing a blockade to try and shut off those exports a bit of a strategic 180. I'd suggest if the goal is to put coercive pressure on the Iranian government, it makes a degree of sense. But I think the question is going to be asked, why not just open with this? Especially given how small a percentage Iranian exports typically make up of global supply, and the fact that some of the primary buyers of Iranian oil, think Beijing, aren't exactly famous for being close American friends and allies. Another question is, where are the GCC navies in all this? While Washington publicly has focused on chastising European and Asian allies for not contributing naval forces to the operation, we haven't seen as much commentary around the absence of the Gulf navies. These are the countries that have been directly attacked by the Iranians, that are suffering the most from having their hydrocarbon exports cut, and which presumably have the greatest interest in applying pressure to Iran to try and get the Strait of Hormuz open. They also have very significant numbers of ships in the region that, sure, might not be top-of-the-line combatants like the American Arleigh Burkes, But if part of the job is maintaining a blockade line or chasing down tankers that are fleeing the scene at a brisk 9 knots, they could potentially be a huge assistance to the United States Navy. And yet we don't see them being deployed in that way, nor do we seem to see Washington publicly calling for it. In any case, as at time of recording, the American blockade appears to be in place, and within its first few days of operation, by April 16th, the US claimed to have already netted 13 ships stopped. Some of those incidents were relatively pedestrian, others perhaps more kinetic than you might expect. Earlier this week, for example, it was reported an Iranian-flagged cargo ship made the bold manoeuvre of trying to evade the US blockade. US ships, specifically the destroyer Spruance, apparently gave it multiple hours worth of warnings and demands to stop, before converting the ask into a bit of a tell by ordering the crew to evacuate the engine room and then slinging a couple of main gun rounds into it. Because apparently while the cops might have spike strips, the Navy has 5-inch shells. US Marines later boarded the vessel by helicopter and seized it. So what we're arguably looking at so far is a situation where you have two very different methods being used to impede trade that a country doesn't like: the traditional blue water Navy style blockade and the more asymmetric Iranian/Houthi/Ukraine style option. And so far at least, both appear to be working. Reportedly, Iranian seaborne oil exports are already cratering. Initially, that probably means the Iranians will redirect production into onshore storage for potential sale later, and we've also seen evidence of them trying to get access to more floating storage. For example, reactivating a 30-year-old very large crude carrier likely is a way to store some additional output. Eventually, though, if this continues, you're going to run out of storage. And at that point, all else being equal, the only option might be to start cutting back on production. Then you have the Iranian effort against other transit in the Strait. And despite all the clashing declarations of the Strait being either open or closed, in practical terms, despite the current ceasefire, the situation in the Strait is basically this. Whether there is a ceasefire in place or not, the UK MTO still gives a critical threat rating to the Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, Gulf of Oman and Arabian Sea. Shipping traffic through said strait is also slightly up from the pre-ceasefire levels, but only very marginally and still well below the levels that we saw before the beginning of the war. The chart you can see on the right there shows you the drop between 28th February and 12th April, while this data here extends that picture out to the 18th. That does show some uptick in transits as the ceasefire went on. Between the 12th and 14th of April, 11 tankers made the transit, while between the 16th and the 18th, it was 16. For cargo vessels, which are usually going to be a little bit less explosive than the tankers, the increase was instead from 5 to 15. Still though, while this is an increase, it's mostly an increase around the statistical margins. You'd need to multiply these numbers several times over to get anything close to normal transit levels. And what that means practically is that despite the supposed ceasefire, global oil prices have remained elevated. In fact, as at time of recording, with Brent reaching about $106 a barrel again, it's not that far shy of the peaks that it achieved during some of the most intense phases of the war so far. Basically, the Schrödinger ceasefire is not getting enough oil out into the global market to calm the prices. And if you look at some of the markets that reflect future expectations, there doesn't appear to be a whole bunch of faith out there that it will be able to do so. What arguably makes that even worse from an energy market perspective is that while you have this period of conflict purgatory, where the war isn't actively being fought kinetically, but at the same time this energy artery is severed or choked, the clock is still ticking down on a lot of the other emergency measures that countries embrace to try and push down prices in the short term. The current price and expectations, for example, reflect massive releases from strategic oil reserves. Those reserves aren't infinite, and those taps can't stay turned on forever. Meaning eventually you'd expect whatever mismatch might exist between supply and demand to get even worse, all else being equal, if some of that Gulf supply remains bottled up, while the flow of energy out of strategic reserves has to slow. And what I think that contributes to is a number of factors that's likely to make this current ceasefire, insofar as it exists, potentially unstable over time. Just for a US perspective, for example, as long as negotiations continue but without a deal, that price at the pump factor is going to be there and the fuse is going to be burning on the global economy. Which gets us to the so what. And it basically boils down to this. We know the world has a number of critical maritime choke points. Hormuz, Suez, Malacca, Gibraltar, Panama, the Bab el-Mandeb, and as we've now seen from multiple actors using different weapons and techniques, from Ukraine's USV-centric force to Iran's missiles and drones to America's Blue Water Navy, it is just so much easier to disrupt those choke points than it is to hold them open. We've also seen, for example, in the Black Sea or with American actions around Cuba, that you don't even necessarily need a maritime choke point. Modern maritime trade is just so vulnerable and so risk-averse that it doesn't take much for a well-equipped or even a moderately equipped force to introduce enough risk into the equation to paralyse entire supply chains like someone just used bloody Thunderwave. That means if you're a country that understands it's reliant on imports for some critical input into its economy, whether that be energy, food, fertiliser, critical raw materials, you name it, you have to be deeply aware of the fact that those supply chains probably can't be taken for granted, and even worse, if you're up against an opponent with the right resources, there's a chance those supply lines might be deliberately cut off in a crisis. Image on the right there, obviously unrelated. This is a lesson that you imagine some countries likely learned during the COVID pandemic, or the blocking of the Suez Canal, and if not that, Houthi operations against the Bab el-Mandeb, or Ukraine in the Black Sea, or finally with the events around the Strait of Hormuz. And for states that do choose to learn that lesson, there's a couple of steps they can potentially take. Option 1 is fairly intuitive, and that's you ruggedise your supply chain somehow. Maybe you diversify your supply, or you'll cut down your reliance in demand. Sure, for example, hydrocarbon supply chains might potentially be vulnerable to disruption, but a nuclear reactor doesn't have to be refueled particularly often, and I've yet to see anyone propose a blockade strategy that could cut a country off from its supply of wind, sun, and rainfall. Or you build a large buffer of reserve supply, so in the event of a disruption, you can coast on your emergency reserves for longer while you try and find a better solution. As you can see on the right there, for example, some countries came into this crisis with a lot more crude oil stored than others. According to the US Energy Information Administration, the US had about 400 million barrels in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, Japan about 263 million barrels, the OECD nations in Europe 179, and the People's Republic of China a casual 1.39 billion barrels. Now, part of what's going on there is what the statistics choose to include as reserves or not, based on just how much control you might expect a government to have over those resources in a crisis. The report suggests, for example, there wasn't 400 million barrels of oil in the United States at the time, there was actually north of 800 million. But 400 of that was held by the United States government and another 400 by commercial firms. In the People's Republic of China, there were only 360 million barrels in government-held inventories and another north of 1,000 in commercial inventories. The main difference? In China, much of that commercial inventory is held by national oil companies, and one imagines that in the event of a crisis, the distinction between China's national reserves and those of its state-owned oil companies would probably narrow pretty quickly once the instructions started coming down from Beijing. The point is, there's actually two elements of stockpiling to think about here. The first is how much reserve there actually is full stop, and the second, when push comes to shove, is who controls it. I think the current and other recent wars have also pretty clearly demonstrated that this is about a lot more than just oil. Brittle supply chains can affect just about anything, and a lot of things are in the end critical. We've seen disruption to fertiliser shipments, for example, helium, as well as separate unrelated concerns over things like rare earth metals and strategic materials. It's worth remembering, I think, that after the Cold War, a lot of countries, including the United States, significantly reduced their strategic stockpiles. The US National Defence Stockpile, for example, was significantly reduced after the fall of the Soviet Union, partly on the assumption that in the future there'd be a roughly 7 to 9 year warning period before a potential major conflict broke out, which would be more than enough time to rebuild stockpiles ahead of it. I don't know about you, but watching the news over the last couple of years, I sometimes feel like we're lucky to get 6 or 7 weeks warning of major events, let alone 6 or 7 years. And so if something is potentially economically critical in a crisis and has a brittle supply chain, the time to think about supply chains and stockpiles is probably now, not in half a decade. A final note there is I think there also needs to be a focus on second-order effects. Basically, you need to be prepared not just for a given supply chain being disrupted, cutting you off from something, but instead all the impacts of everyone else getting cut off from that thing. Because even if you're sufficiently prepared, someone else failing to be sufficiently prepared might have knock-on effects for your economy, your industry, and your consumers. Another area to look at is how to get better at protecting these vital sea lanes. That probably means a couple of things, including looking at capabilities both old and new. On the old side, we've already talked about mine countermeasures in the past and how the United States arguably didn't come into this war particularly well equipped to do large-scale mine clearing in the Strait of Hormuz and Persian Gulf. And on the maritime escort side, where a force might benefit from having a bunch of frigates, for example, to augment its more powerful destroyers and cruisers. See every video we've done on the channel about the US Navy's long and storied efforts to actually design and procure a useful number of functional frigates. But I also think there's a role to discuss for newer systems and technologies. USVs have proven very useful in the attack for the Ukrainians, for example, but we've also seen countries experiment with using them more defensively, to patrol harbours, for example. One imagines that where you have a very dangerous but strategic waterway, like the Strait of Hormuz or the Bab el-Mandeb, and you'd like to be able to send assets in there, To monitor it, defend it, protect shipping there, or hunt for mines, navies might be much more willing to send in the proverbial drone swarm to give them that awareness and that presence, as opposed to sailing a billion-dollar warship up the gauntlet with a 3-figure crew on board. In terms of the tactics and technology, this kind of approach is still pretty early in its development. But the proof of concept for this kind of deployment is there. We've seen that you can put useful sensors on unmanned platforms, that you can network them together, and that you can potentially equip them with useful weapon systems to defend against a wide array of targets. And so in a scenario where numbers and risks matter, I imagine navies might be looking fairly closely. If you can go a lot further protecting convoys with a handful of destroyers and a swarm of drones than you can with just a handful of destroyers. Finally, on the defence side, there's an element that both the Iranians and Americans appear to have struggled with, which is denying the other side the ability to deny. We haven't seen the United States be able to totally knock offline Iran's ability to attack ships in the Strait or the Persian Gulf, while the Iranians have proven repeatedly capable of hitting merchant ships, but despite repeated claimed attempts, have found US Navy warships standing off at a distance to be much, much more difficult targets. Which also, I think, leads to a final note here, which is as well as navies around the world thinking about how to respond to these kind of threats defensively, I think there's some strategic value to be had in even regular blue water navies thinking about how they might potentially engage in a bit of role reversal, channel their inner Jack Sparrow, run up the Jolly Roger, and achieving deterrence by showing off their ability to disrupt an opponent's trade instead. The point here is that even if you might be able to break maritime trade with relatively simple and accessible tools, with the kind of fancier kit available to better funded navies, you might be able to break it even harder. The extra-large and extra-large uncrewed underwater vehicles, for example, being adopted by countries like the United States, Russia, People's Republic of China, Australia, Great Britain, the list goes on, are potentially useful for an enormous range of tasks, but you could also use them for things like mine laying. While an Iranian speedboat might be able to take its chances to lay some comparatively simple naval mines and hope it doesn't get detected on the way in or out, a handful of UUVs are probably much less likely to be detected, and if they're able to lay a number of, for example, tethered torpedoes in the right place, all of a sudden your opponent has to deal with a potentially very dangerous but unknown mine threat. Ultimately, we don't yet know how effective this American approach, using an offensive blockade to counterbalance the other side's effective blockade, is going to prove to be. But I think we can already assess that it appears to be working, it's likely to be very expensive for the Iranians, and it's the kind of strategic capability that other nations might be encouraged to replicate. Moving on from the maritime domain, I want to pivot to space, because here I think the war in Iran has already brought something home fairly well that we were already seeing pretty clearly in the war in Ukraine, and that's that space-based assets have become so common and orbital imagery so good and so widely accessible that militaries now probably have to proceed on the assumption that almost any opponent they deal with, whether they have satellite constellations of their own or not, are probably going to have access to the kind of intelligence that militaries back in the 1960s or 70s could only have dreamt of. To an extent, that accessibility extends even to members of the public. For example, even though the Israeli and American militaries were releasing relatively few videos and photographs of their strikes, we were still able to use satellite before and after images to track as Iranian base after Iranian base was struck and in many cases flattened. Likewise, some of our best evidence of Iran's successful strikes on targets in the Middle East once again came from commercial satellite imagery. However, during this war, there's been a twist. As the war went on, some providers stopped publishing images. On the 4th of April, for example, major satellite imagery provider Planet Labs said they would be indefinitely withholding visuals not just of countries where US troops were based in the Middle East, but also Iran itself, and that the California-based firm was doing that on the basis of a request from the US government. Essentially, even if I was willing to pay to get a satellite to take an image to check whether an Iranian base was still there or not, something that might be a very easy exercise for a Russian target, for example, this order basically said to the market, shut up and keep your money. Now, you might suggest that trying to censor satellite imagery or maps in the 2020s is a bit of a Sisyphean task. You remember back when it was reported that Russia started blurring out some sensitive military installations on Yandex, that it basically became a bit of a point-and-laugh moment. Because while Russia could blur the sites on Yandex, indirectly drawing a giant circle around the location saying something interesting here, they couldn't blur it on every other mapping service. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the likes of Google Maps was still happy to provide anyone that wanted crisp images of these locations if you were interested in what happened to be there. In this case, the denial of service was regional, not localised to an individual sensitive factory or airbase, but I'd suggest a similar principle applied. It didn't stop interested parties getting access to the relevant images or information, it just forced them to go to other, potentially unfriendly providers. That, for example, might mean the use of Chinese imagery, meaning from a US perspective, you're not just diverting purchasing power towards potential competitors, you're also now potentially giving those competitors the initiative over what information they choose to release or not release, and thus how they shape the overall information space. We're well past the era where anyone has a monopoly on satellite imagery, although keep in mind the restrictions still meant that it was harder to check things than it may otherwise have been. From a practical perspective, the war in Ukraine had already demonstrated how a country without a significant reconnaissance satellite program of its own could potentially leverage commercial satellites to create a kind of we have space-based ISR at home capability. One famous example of this we saw is that back in 2022, a Ukrainian crowdfunding campaign actually raised enough to put an ISI satellite into orbit. Over the roughly 2 years to June 2024, the Ukrainians claim that satellite took north of 4,100 images of Russian targets, including images of, quote, 370 Russian airfields, 238 air defence and reconnaissance positions, 153 oil depots and fuel storage facilities, 147 missile, aircraft, weapon and ammunition depots, and 17 naval bases. The state of the market is that countries don't need the capacity to design and build their own satellites. They can outsource that, and even the Russians have done so in the past. And they also don't need the ability to launch the things themselves. You can contract that as well. In some cases, you won't even need a dedicated launch. You might be able to pay instead essentially for a rideshare option where your satellite hitches a ride up into orbit with someone else's cargo. And even if you don't want to pass the hand around for your own satellite or satellites, just like companies or individuals, countries can also choose to just buy imagery in. Again, Ukraine's use of Finnish ISI synthetic aperture radar satellites comes to mind here, with the added benefit that because these are technically neutral assets, in practical diplomatic terms, they're very difficult for a country like Russia to attack or negate. You don't want to shoot down the satellites because those belong to NATO member Finland. You can't go after the ground control infrastructure because that's not in Ukraine either. In cases like this, there might still be some deniable options available. Cyber attack comes to mind, but all else being equal, you'd expect it to be a lot harder than going after, for example, space control infrastructure that was based in Ukraine itself. If we pivot then to the war in the Middle East, there have been some claims the United States might have gotten a bit of the Russia treatment, with it being reported that US intelligence has suggested that while Iran doesn't have significant spy satellite constellations of its own, it might have been getting access to imagery or targeting information from countries like Russia or China. I'd suggest that while the question of whether or not there's any state-to-state cooperation there is an important one, in other ways it's kind of beside the point. While there are cases where you'd need a national government to sign off on something, for example providing information from military reconnaissance satellites, in the absence of an actual ban, the commercial products are always going to be there. And however it's happened, it certainly seems like Iran has been able to successfully identify and then attack some very valuable American and allied targets. Some of the hits, like on the AN/TPY-2 radar supporting THAAD batteries, or the attacks on American tankers and E-3 AWACS aircraft, have involved a combination of a very precise attack on a very valuable target. We obviously can't be sure that satellite imagery or intelligence from other countries assisted the Iranians in their targeting, but it is credible. Credible enough, I'd suggest, that planning for future contingencies should probably assume that an opponent is probably going to get access to this kind of intel one way or another. That observation, of course, does come with some limitations. Satellite imagery in general, but especially commercial satellite imagery, isn't good if you're dealing with dynamic targets. It tends to include a time delay, and I think it's worth noting that when we look at some of Iran's most successful drone and missile attacks, they've almost universally been against things that don't tend to move around too much. Air defence installations that, unlike the Ukrainians, the Gulf states don't seem to shuffle around that much, air bases, and of course valuable economic targets like LNG facilities that aren't famously known for their tactical mobility. Similarly, during the war in Ukraine, except in cases where drones are able to provide real-time footage, we've often seen the Russians struggle when it comes to hitting relatively dynamic or fleeting targets behind Ukrainian lines. Russia has reconnaissance satellites, for example, but apparently that hasn't been enough by itself to close the kill chain and enable successful missile strikes against Ukraine's aircraft on the ground, for example. However, in true Peruvian fashion, I do think that caveat comes with a caveat. And that's that just because 2020's era Iran or Russia didn't have access to the capability to tie together space-based reconnaissance and responsive fires in a really dangerous way, that doesn't mean other countries, especially in the future, won't be able to do it. US space-based ISR is already on a totally different level, and there are other states, the People's Republic of China comes to mind, that are investing a lot to build up their resources in that area as well. For now, there are still some capability areas where access can still potentially be limited. One of the reasons Starlink being shut off for the Russian military, for example, hurt so much is because none of the readily available alternatives to the Russians really provided a direct one-for-one replacement. But as far as space-based reconnaissance goes, accessibility is arguably already here, and forces are going to have to be prepared for what that means for space as a domain for competition, and also what it means back on Earth, especially when you combine that sort of battlefield transparency with some of the weapon systems we've seen the Iranians effectively demonstrate. As I said near the start, a lot of what we've seen with the war in the Middle East isn't strictly speaking new. It's more that the fighting has just given us more data to prove out already suspected trends. That's true with the threats we've seen to seaborne trade, and also with the threat we've seen demonstrated by Iran's ballistic missiles and one-way attack drones. Both of these are the kind of systems we've seen used by Iran in the past, used by other countries like Russia in the past, and which have long been integrated into assumptions and war games. And yet, when push came to kinetic shove, we still saw the Iranians demonstrate a couple of things pretty clearly that previously had mostly been hypotheticals. Firstly, with regards to targeting, while a lot of Iranian ballistic missiles and some of their drone strikes were highly inaccurate, they also demonstrated the ability for some relatively precise strikes against valuable rear area enablers. This matters because, for the most part, Iran's less accurate ballistic missile attacks, at least the ones that haven't been intercepted, have generally been pretty bad at causing casualties or massive amounts of damage. Especially when you start talking about a medium-range ballistic missile, for example, that you might be able to sling from Iran proper out to Israel, you're just talking about a very, very expensive way to deliver a chunk of high explosives. But the math changes significantly if you're able to use a ballistic missile or a swarm of one-way attack drones to relatively precisely go after a sufficiently valuable target. On the civilian side, you can probably put Iran's ballistic missile attacks on LNG facilities in that category. But on the military side, if we go after all the American equipment that we can identify being hit by these systems, there are two main valuable categories that stand out. Expensive, very difficult to replace ground-based radar systems, like those for THAAD, because by hitting those, you can potentially degrade the air defense system, enabling your other missiles to hit other targets. And on the other hand, to try and mitigate America's offensive potential, we saw the Iranians destroy or damage a number of US Air Force enablers. You can see an E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft on screen here, but I'd also put the reportedly damaged KC-135 tankers in this same category. With these hits on enablers and ground-based sensors, there's a few things we know and a few things we still don't. We can be fairly confident, for example, based on the visual evidence and the reporting, that Iran did hit them, which serves as a potential proof of concept for any other country with equivalent systems that might be looking down the barrel of an opposing air campaign or an integrated air defense system and wondering if they can do the same. What we don't know is how much investment the Iranians put into scoring the hits that they did, how many missiles and drones were used, what kinds. But if more of that data becomes available, modelling these kind of threats is likely to become easier. The war also provided a reminder that ballistic missiles can be used to deliver a lot more than just large unitary warheads. We saw this, for example, with the Iranians pivoting to the use of cluster munitions against Israeli targets, presumably in part because unless the air defense system can get the missile before the submunitions separate, you're now potentially dealing with the challenge of intercepting dozens of warheads rather than one. One report from Israel in early March suggested that at that point, about 50% of Iranian missiles being fired against Israeli targets use cluster rather than unitary warheads, while other reports suggest the IDF made the decision not to try and intercept every submunition that was released. From a defender's perspective, you can imagine situations where that kind of decision is going to make sense. If you're fairly confident your population has made it into bomb shelters, for example, it may not make a lot of sense to spend air defense interceptors trying to shoot down essentially supersonic hand grenades. And as a way to cause significant casualties or destroy buildings on the ground, small bomblets are going to be deeply limited in their effect. But as the war in Ukraine has demonstrated, under the right conditions, being able to deliver cluster munitions using a ballistic missile, for example, Iskander or the American ATACMS, can potentially be very, very dangerous to soft military targets in the open, as we saw, for example, with the Ukrainian use of cluster missiles against Russian helicopter bases. The cluster payloads we saw the Iranians use are probably too dispersed for that kind of purpose. But I suspect some planners, looking at the experiences across these two conflicts, are likely to be very aware of the potential threat posed if an opponent possesses the ability to deliver those ATACMS-style air-based showering effects, but over more Iranian-style distances. Speaking of which, this war also had something to tell us about the range of Iranian missiles. Long before the recent conflict, Iran's position had been that its missiles couldn't exceed a range of 2,000 kilometres. That gets you the dark inner circle you can see in the map on the right there. Missiles with enough range to, for example, reach most of Ukraine or out to Greece, or alternatively strike relatively deep into India, but still leaving much of Europe, Russia and China out of Iranian reach. During the war, though, we got some pretty strong evidence that 2,000 kilometres isn't exactly a hard limit for Iranian capabilities, because they reportedly fired 2 ballistic missiles at the joint US-UK base on the island of Diego Garcia, a casual 2,500 miles or 4,000 kilometres. In terms of military effect, the reported attack was a complete non-event. It's claimed one missile broke up during the flight, while another was intercepted by American missile defences. But if you can fire a missile 4,000 kilometres, not just 2,000 kilometres, suddenly you're talking about Iranian missiles that can reach the likes of Helsinki and Oslo, Paris, Berlin, all of India, or much of North Africa, which obviously, if you're one of those countries, is a very different strategic proposition. Some of the Iranian messaging we saw around the claimed missile attack was diverse. The semi-official Mehr news agency confirmed the attack, saying it was a significant step that shows the range of Iran's missiles is beyond what the enemy previously imagined, end quote, while some figures in the Iranian government denied that Iran had anything to do with it, suggesting this somehow might have been a kind of false flag attack. Most of what we know or think we know then about the attack and what it might mean for Iran's missile capabilities necessarily has to come from outside Iran itself, with two big questions being what kind of missile it was and whether any of this should be surprising. To answer the second question first, from a basic engineering perspective, I'd argue probably not. The key point here is that the range of a ballistic missile is a flexible and changeable thing. If someone says a system has a range of 2,000 kilometres, it's always 2,000 kilometres with an asterisk. If a Khorramshahr missile can travel 2,000 kilometres with a more than 1-ton warhead under ordinary conditions, for example, if you reduce that warhead weight significantly and add more fuel instead, then some analysts suggest the math is fairly clear, you'd be able to make it to Diego Garcia with a very light warhead just. What that highlights is one of the ways countries can potentially get around missile range restrictions. You design a system with a very heavy warhead or reduced amount of propellant with a stated maximum range, but you do so on the understanding that you can reconfigure it to go further if the military requirements call for it. So if these were existing known Iranian missile designs stripped down to make the long-range flight, that's probably not a huge surprise from the American perspective, and may not be much of a make or break in negotiations, with one potential American concern being making sure that Iran never gets to the point where they can convert their experience in space launch vehicles into a functional ICBM. Because while threatening the Strait of Hormuz might be a powerful move from a deterrence perspective, being able to potentially deliver a payload to the continental United States, that's the kind of thing Iranian military planners might want to have in their back pocket, and American military planners are probably keen to avoid. But to just bring things back to the core point, I think the observation to be made here is that while ballistic missiles have repeatedly proven to be pretty inefficient weapons when it comes to just indiscriminately attacking cities or area targets, especially if you're able to provide a degree of precision with a munition that will tolerate a little bit of inaccuracy, like a cluster payload, then you're suddenly, in from your opponent's perspective, very dangerous business. When it comes to those capabilities, the Iranians are far from the most well-equipped force out there. The US demonstrated some very precise strikes using ATACMS and PRISM. Many countries around the world have extensive missile and rocket forces, some of whom include some very hard-to-intercept systems, like advanced ballistic and hypersonic threats. And if current global trends continue, it's likely those kind of systems are going to become both more common and more capable as time goes on. That raises a massive defensive problem. Not just for vital civilian infrastructure, but for things like those critical enablers, the tankers, the AWACS, other aircraft on the ground, or critical fixed infrastructure like radar systems that tend to fail their dodge checks. For this war, one of the primary responses to those kind of threats by the United States and its allies has been to employ active air and missile defences, aka to protect yourself against the ballistic missile, shoot down the ballistic missile. But that approach has served to highlight an observation we made about the war in Ukraine, and effectively dial it up to 11. Let me explain. If you told me I had to put my defence economics hat on and only make two broad observations about the use of missile-based air defence systems in both Ukraine and the war in the Middle East, I'd probably say it's been a bit of a good news, bad news situation for the air defenders. The good news is that when appropriately equipped, air defence systems seem to work mostly. Ukraine, with its menagerie of air defence systems but relative shortage of things like Patriot, has consistently scored relatively high interception rates against things like subsonic cruise missiles and one-way attack drones, but struggled a bit when it comes to the ballistics. In the Middle Eastern context, interception rates against drones and cruise missiles were still high, but the ballistic missile interception rates were pretty elevated as well. Stuff is always going to slip through, but a lot of stuff didn't. That's the good news. The bad news is the kind of defensive approach we just saw also seems to chew through air defence munitions at a treasury melting rate. Recently, the CSIS published their updated estimates for the use of high-end US munitions during the war in the Middle East. Their final count was at least 1,000 of 3,100 Tomahawks, 1,000 of 4,400 JASSMs, likely most of the precision strike missiles currently in service, and then between 320 and more than 600 standard missiles fired by the Navy, most of the Talon stockpile for THAAD, and perhaps half of the Army's Patriot stockpile. This is the kind of thing that will take years to replace, is likely to have implications for readiness in the Asia-Pacific, in which we're already seeing flow through to US arms contracts and supplies to allies. For planners, I think that raises a very serious question. If an opponent like the Iranians, with their relatively limited financial resources, are able to force the combination of the United States, Israel, and the Gulf countries to burn through a significant chunk of their very expensive air defense interceptor stock over the course of just a couple of weeks of fighting, what does that potentially mean for how long the magazines would last if the opponent on the other side of the exchange was a bit better resourced and had some deeper magazines? That same logic also applies in reverse. If you're a potential competitor considering the threat posed by an arsenal of thousands of long-range precision weapons in US or some other country's storage, you might have reason to look at the interceptor burn rates in the Middle East and potentially reassessing how much damage you expect to take over the course of a protracted war. The reality is, against a better equipped opponent, the math is pretty clear that even a country like the United States couldn't afford to sustain a defence in this way. In terms of how states are responding or might respond to that piece of inconvenient air defence truth, presuming that just asking your troops to face tank bombardment isn't considered a viable option, there's going to be incentives to find ways to get more out of the active defences available, while also reducing the strain on those defences and the consequences of interceptor stocks potentially running low. An obvious answer is just produce more air defence interceptors, and to an extent that's already happening. But that approach is always going to run into the risk of your opponent seeing you do exactly that and deciding to resize their offensive arms in order to compensate. That potentially puts you on the economic losing side of an arms race, and so I'd argue there probably has to be more to it. Tactics and techniques are probably part of the equation. The Ukrainians, for example, operate a lot of the same systems we saw in action in the Middle East, but without going into too much detail, reportedly, their approach to using the limited supply of interceptors they have available looks very different. The Ukrainians have a different approach to risk, and they have a different approach to rationing munitions. And I bring that up not to suggest the Ukrainian approach is going to be the correct approach for every military out there, but to stress that in the real world, there's no such thing as an infinite ammo cheat, and it probably makes sense to look at the practical experience of a country that's gotten very good at rationing. There's also an obvious space for complementary technologies here. Advanced air defense systems are great and really good at shooting stuff out of the sky, but that potentially makes it tempting to crutch on them for targets that might be more efficiently dealt with by something else. The prior planning trick then is to make sure you're stocked up with the said something else, supported by the appropriate training and doctrine, before you find yourself in a conflict where you need them. But I think one of the most surprising potential shortfalls that came out over the course of March and early April has less to do with Allied air defence tactics, systems and available munitions, and more to do with a bit of a classic bling versus basics problem. If you're trying to mitigate the effects of opposing missile or drone attacks against your infrastructure, air defence systems will help you do that. But you know what else helps protect your equipment and personnel? Dirt. Or even better, rock and concrete. The Iranians went into this war short on complex air defence systems, but long on bunkers, concrete and buried facilities. And I think it's fairly telling that for at least some of the buried missile cities, the air campaign was able to collapse entrances, but not necessarily destroy the facility itself. On the flip side, CENTCOM went into this conflict very well stocked with some of the best air defence systems that money can buy, but apparently skipped out on the passive defences a bit. Because come March, while there were still Patriots and standard missiles available to fire against incoming Iranian missiles, the Pentagon was looking at the market to rapidly get their hands on more bunkers, with fielding more hardened shelters to better protect US forces at bases in the Middle East apparently a top priority. Vendors were asked to submit options for 3 different timeframes, delivery in the next 3 days, 15 days, and 30 days. Now, while hindsight is always 20/20, based on everything from published war games to recent battlefield experiences in places like Ukraine, I think it's reasonable to look at this aspect, passive defences against enemy strikes, so hardening or concealment, and basically ask, why? Why after decades of wargaming a potential war with Iran, a country known to have significant stocks of ballistic missiles, one-way attack drones, cruise missiles, and everything in between, would you be caught trying to rapidly harden your bases against missile and drone attack after a war that you initiated has already started? Why, despite knowing what overhead assets are out there and seeing the experience of air defense systems that stay static for too long in Ukraine, Were some of the countries involved here taking their multi-billion-dollar air defence systems, putting them in place, and then just not moving them around, potentially allowing plenty of time for a satellite overpass to spot them to be identified, that information to be passed, a missile and or drone strike to be planned, and then executed. You probably wouldn't have to be moving these things particularly often in order to break the Iranian kill chain, especially given the potential state of their command and control system at a point where losing a general officer was a near-daily event. You could also ask why about other potential passive defensive measures as well. Why would you invest the enormous sums necessary in a complex air and missile defence system, but not go a little bit further to deploy the kind of decoys and concealment that are routinely used by the Russians and Ukrainians to great success? These were not mobile field formations that need to move long distances quickly and might struggle to transport bulky decoys. They were overwhelmingly fixed, permanent installations. And why in some cases did valuable enablers have to be parked, exposed, and in the open? And that contrasts with some of the trends we've seen out of Russia and China, where the construction of at least basic aircraft shelters that can, if nothing else, conceal the presence or lack thereof of an aircraft from an overflying satellite has been the order of the day for some time now. China has continued to crank out aircraft shelters, some hardened, some not. Meanwhile, the VKS, after Ukraine's Operation Spider's Web, appears to have at least partially learnt its lesson about parking incredibly valuable aircraft in the open and started a significant campaign of shelter construction. Are they always good aircraft shelters? No. But against something like a small drone, a cluster munition, or a satellite overflight, the thinking seems to be that even the basics might make all the difference. Some of the potential adaptations or responses to those kind of shortfalls are arguably probably about as obvious as they're going to be unwelcome in some military circles. While many planners would probably much rather direct resources towards new aircraft, munitions, training, research and development, more flight hours, or better food and beverage offerings in the mess hall before they invested a single dollar in concrete and dirt, I think there's a strong argument to suggest that for a lot of military infrastructure, especially air bases and air defence installations, passive defence should no longer be considered optional. No, your average hardened shelter is not going to save an aircraft from a 2,000-pound bunker buster. But not every threat is a 2,000-pound bunker buster. It might protect you from a one-way attack drone. It might save you from a near miss by a cruise or ballistic missile. It might force an opponent who could otherwise get away with simply lightly dusting your airbase or air defence battery with cluster munitions to instead dedicate a much larger attack to try and break through with heavy unitary payloads. And as fancy as some modern reconnaissance satellites have become, there are still things they can sometimes struggle with, like a very high-fidelity decoy or, a roof. That's not to say that ideas like agile employment, where you constantly shuffle aircraft between bases to avoid an enemy attack, can't work. After all, it's one of the ways the Ukrainians have been able to keep a lot of their fighter fleet intact, constantly shuffling them between air bases to protect against Russian missile attack. But based on the targeting priorities we saw for Iran's ballistic missiles and drones, in a conflict scenario, the agile fighters that can rapidly scramble or shuffle between bases may not be the primary targets. In order to do their best work, they need the enablers. They need the tankers, they need the AWACS, and that makes them potentially very juicy targets for these kind of long-range threats. And so we might see more thinking invested, I'd suggest, in how you keep these vital pieces of the puzzle alive, both in the air and on the ground, in the same ways we see navies recognise the need to protect their oilers and transport ships. The idea that valuable assets like aircraft or radar might be vulnerable to missile or drone attack on the ground is far from new. We've talked about it before on the channel after Operation Spider's Web, and there's no shortage of studies or wargames out there that have highlighted the potential risk. In one CSIS wargame of a Taiwan Straits escalation scenario, for example, the United States lost something like 40% of its fighter and attack aircraft inventory over the course of the wargame, and one of the most dangerous places for a US fighter to be was on the ground. When the wargamers modelled different alterations to the scenario to tilt the results one way or the other, one factor they identified that significantly tilted things towards the blue team was just modelling additional hardened aircraft shelters at some of the Allied bases. In a lot of scenarios, if you care about effect achieved relative to dollars invested, you're often going to find dirt, concrete, ambiguity, and lower-tier defences, a difficult combination to beat. In the grand scheme of things, and compared to the scale of its inventory, the US Air Force didn't take particularly notable losses from Iranian missile and drone attacks. The AWACS and tanker attacks were notable, but most aircraft losses were to more conventional threats, surface-to-air missiles, accidents, or friendly fire courtesy of the Ghost of Kuwait. The question for planners is, how different might things potentially look if you take a hypothetical scenario and swap out the Iranian force for one with more advanced missiles, deep magazines, extensive ISR and planning capabilities, and everything needed to potentially stretch air defences to their absolute limit. That's, I'd suggest, where the Iranian experience indicates that passive defences would be at their most premium. But whether those who write and approve defence budgets ultimately agree with that sentiment, only time will tell. Now, if we had an infinite amount of time, there's a laundry list of other observations we could potentially go through. We could talk about small UAS, for example, and the way that threat is rapidly appearing in other places, not just Ukraine. We could highlight defensive counterfactuals, like the US Embassy in Baghdad, which, like many US installations, has been extensively targeted and hit, but significantly less so than it may otherwise have been, because unlike some other facilities, the Baghdad Embassy had a CRAM defence system, meaning that for every piece of incoming that made it to the target, many others ended up like this, or this. There's also probably a lot to be said about the American experience using expensive but still pretty vulnerable drones like Reaper. These proved very useful and obviously kept pilots out of harm's way, but the Americans did lose something like 24 of the things over the course of a relatively short war. That might raise questions about future investment priorities and what drones are best suited for potential peer and near-peer opponents, with one argument being that middle-of-the-road drones like Reaper might be a bad idea, compared to a mixture of drones that are either cheap enough that you don't mind losing them to the opponent's air defense system, or advanced and survivable enough that you don't expect to lose as many of them. But I think a key closing observation is that, as is often the case, complacency is incredibly dangerous. As the Russians have arguably demonstrated in Ukraine, if you underestimate a potential opponent, reality, when you have to face it, can hit like a JDAM. Ultimately, I'd argue military developments and effectiveness aren't just about pushing technology forward as fast as possible. It's not just a numbers game. It's also about watching the environment, clinically evaluating it, and responding to evidence when you see it. For better or worse, between Ukraine and the war in the Middle East, we now have plenty of evidence of some of the kind of effects modern weapon systems and networks can achieve. As for who chooses to learn the potential lessons, though, only time will tell. And okay, channel update to close out. As I noted near the start of the episode, originally I was going to cover the outcomes of the ceasefire this week, but after the announcement that was going to be extended, I decided it might be worth holding that back just a little bit more to see if there are any other developments I might want to reflect in that episode that take place over the next week or so. In the interim, I hope you got something out of this episode, with the obvious caveat that these are based on very early information, and there's always a chance that new data or insights might come out tomorrow that shift the entire analytical picture. In terms of other updates for the channel, Peru Gaming, you guys should be back on a fairly regular schedule, at least for the next couple of weeks. And for the patrons, after a little bit of a delay as I adjusted the terms of the challenge, that post seeking your feedback and contributions, I won't say any more here, should now be live by the time this video is. Beyond that, thank you very much to all of you as always for your support and engagement, and with any luck, I'll see you again next week.